Yo, what's up, everyone? Thank you for tuning in yet again. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to be joined by Mx Rashbrooke. Max is kind of a big deal. He's an journalist for a range of publications, such as The Guardian. He's an author. You've got two books out. Yeah, you got your first book was called Inequality, simply. And then your new book is called Too Much Money, which I've just ordered online. Unfortunately, it hasn't arrived yet because I really wanted to get into it, but I've read some excerpts from it in The Guardian. And you're also a researcher looking at revitalizing democracy, I suppose, and of course, economic inequality, wealth disparity. So I'm really excited to talk to you. Thank you for making time to chat with little old me, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, no, thanks. It's great to be here.
So, Max, why inequality? Like, what is your passion behind why I guess you've dedicated so many years of your life to understanding this issue?
Well, I mean, I guess, I've had a slightly unconventional path into it. I remember once I was doing a talk at Unitec, right? And Unitec has a lot of second chance learners and a lot of people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I did my sort of big spiel, did the talk, and then afterwards, this young woman who was a student on the course that I was addressing came up to me and she said, look, I really just wanted to ask, are you from the struggle or from the 1%? Like, which was a really funny question. But she obviously, and I'd never heard the term, being from the struggle, but obviously I instantly knew what she meant. But she obviously just couldn't work out why this, kind of well-spoken white guy in a suit was really exercised about, the disparity between rich and poor, and why do some people have so much money than others, and how does that come about, and what are the structures that make it all happen? And I had to say, look, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, my family weren't the 1%, but we were pretty close to that. We're an awful lot closer to that than being from the struggle. But it just comes down to values, right? And my parents, they didn't tell us that we were well off because we were like these supermen and superwomen who were better than everyone else and had worked harder and were brighter and deserved everything we got. They knew that there was a lot of luck involved in where we were, and that we were really fortunate, and as kids we were having an upbringing that other children weren't going to get through circumstance and unfairness, and that a good society is one that kind of pushes back against the luck of birth, if you like. A good society is one that tries to ensure that everyone has got enough for a decent life, and that you can succeed whether or not your parents happen to be able to give you a good start in life. So that was a big thing for me. And then, and again, because my parents are a bit eccentric like this, we grew up in a really wealthy suburb, but they sent me to a Decile 3 high school, that had a really diverse ethnic mix. And that also sort of helped open my eyes to the fact that, an awful lot of people had an upbringing that was completely different to mine, and were grappling with totally different problems to the ones that I had. And I think that just really sort of cemented a desire in me to see a society that was fairer, where everyone was flourishing, not just those who had the luck of birth.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Your parents really set you on this path, like intentionally, huh? To make a more equitable world.
Yeah, and it's so different to one of the patterns that I talk a lot about in the book, because the new book, Too Much Money, is about economic inequality. It's about who's got what and who hasn't, but it's kind of it's taking that story and then it's stepping it out one level and saying, well, it's not just about some people having a lot more wealth than others. It's also what are all the other things that wealth buys, increasingly in New Zealand. Like, it buys you better housing, and it buys you a house in the grammar zone, right? And then being in one of those schools, getting your kids into those schools means they're in schools that, like, the top level university courses disproportionately recruit from, and so then you're on this kind of up elevator, up escalator, you know, you're getting this head start in life that other kids don't have. And that really grinds my gears. You know, there's so much like competition now among parents about getting their kids into, quote, the right school, which means getting them into the school, frankly, that's got the right kids in it, you know. And there's so much disdain, I think, now towards poorer children and children who are Māori and Pacifica. And yeah, and my parents, bless them, were totally different. You know, they thought it would be good for me to go to a school where I wasn't surrounded with people who were from the same background as me. And you know what, they were absolutely right.
How did you find that? Did you feel like the odd one out, like at perhaps a more working class school when you had come from a more economically affluent background? Was that tough?
Yeah, I mean, okay, and you'll probably relate to this. One of the things that got me through is that I was good at sport, you know, and I played a lot of sport, and that wins you so many brownie points, right, at high school. So that totally helped me survive. Yeah, I mean, I did at times feel like an odd one out, and I didn't make a lot of close friends, you know, in the way that I might have done at a different school. At the same time, I got on well with everyone. I mean, and I've written about this, you know, it was so striking, right? I went to a primary school in the area I grew up. So it was a decile 10 primary school, very wealthy. And, you know, when it became known that I was going to go to this low decile high school, you know, a lot of the kids I was at primary school said really prejudiced things. You know, they said, oh, you're going to a school for cabbages. You know, that's what they said. You know, that's a phrase that, I mean, that a lot of New Zealanders will be familiar with, but it's a very stereotyped phrase. And there were all these dire warnings about what the Polynesian kids, quote unquote, were going to do to me. And of course, basically none of that came true. I mean, I got some hassles, I got some stuff that was sort of like almost on the edge of being bullied, but not really even, you know, actually it was, people were pretty respectful. They were pretty respectful about the fact that I was doing well academically. Like I said, I played a lot of sport, and you know, and I basically had a fine high school experience. I mean, I didn't love it, but I mean, honestly, who loves their time at high school, really? You know?
Oh, I know, bro. I know. Yeah, high school was. I went to a really working class high school. Like I have, I guess, more of a lower middle class, working class background. Because, you know, it's public knowledge, my father has a whole lot of dysfunction. So we didn't have a whole lot of money because he drank it all. But at the same time, yeah, I'm the same as you. Like I got like a social pass through getting good at combat sports. Do you know what I mean? Like I positioned myself. It wasn't like a class thing at my school because most of us were sort of, there wasn't a lot of money in it. But yeah, I guess that's something I think about a lot these days, like the differences between us, class-based or identity-based. That seems to be like a lot of the one or the other in the public discourse at the moment. And I just finished reading Toward Freedom by Turia Fried, who's an American writer, and he talks a lot more about class, and that we actually would do a much better job of narrowing the disparities between, I guess, identity groups if we focused on class rather than on like cultural tutelage and diversity and equity and, you know, sort of trainings that have become an emergent part of the working environment these days. And I was curious to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's true to an extent. I mean, I'm always really nervous about any analysis that sort of tries to, you know, pit one kind of identity against another. You know, I mean, I think they're all really important. And I think that's what you're getting at as well. But there has been, and I think most people know this, but, you know, really crudely in the last 40 years, there's been this sort of, you know, this push against talking about class and things related to class. And obviously you have to unpack, I mean, what even is class? What does it mean when we're talking about it? But there's definitely been a downplaying of that, you know, downplaying of the idea that people are sort of, you know, separated by their levels of, you know, economic wealth and kind of, you know, education and sort of cultural confidence and all these things that go around that, and much more emphasis on how are we separated, how are our lives directed by issues like ethnicity and gender. And what I'm trying to do with the book is just put class back there in the mix, not to say, hey, this is more important than anything else, but just to say, the way that's been downplayed in the last 40 years, is a real problem. And it's something that we have to put back into the mix, because I think it really does help us understand, how are people's lives shaped? How can people sometimes be separated out from each other? How are these hierarchies created? And what creates enduring differences in life opportunities? I mean, misogyny and sexism and racism profoundly affect people's life chances, but so do people's access to wealth and education and, certain kinds of lifestyle and sort of cultural capital. And so I'm just trying to put all that stuff back in the mix.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I guess on a personal level, thank you for doing that. Like, I think that's a really important part of the conversation that has been missing, because you're right, it's not one or the other, it's all these things at once. Like, I think intersectionality is a really important part of the equation, but it's not everything. So I really appreciate that you've written a book and spent years researching it in order to make that contribution and help us, be solutions focused. I really like that you mentioned cultural capital, because often we forget about that, right? It's not just like the property or the money that you inherit that can give you this enormous head start in life. It's the social networks and being read to after school and what food you eat and, how to look someone in the eye and shake their hand, perhaps at a business meeting. All these sorts of perhaps less tangible things, they also have a huge impact on one's life outcomes. Can you explain that a little more for people who might not be familiar with the concept?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of like, if you get right down to it, for me, class, social class is about, I do think it starts with wealth often, and the difference is just in pure economic wealth that people have. But then you get that effect I was talking about earlier, that wealth buys all these other things. And so you've got, a group of people at the top who've got not just economic wealth, but they've got access to all these other things, education and housing and social capital, like the networks you were talking about, the connections, the things that help you, make business deals or find out about job opportunities or move in the right circles. But then there's also this cultural capital, and the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu was kind of the guy who, popularized this idea. And he always said that kind of education you get, which is about, having what's regarded as good taste in things, liking the right kinds of forms of art, speaking in the right way, having the right sort of social airs and graces, having the right taste in food, all these kinds of things, is an inheritance, just like inheriting a house. That's what Bourdieu always said. And when you have those knowledges, that sort of cultural capital, that confidence in your cultural tastes, it's another thing you can use to buttress your position in the hierarchy. And it's another thing that you can use to make people feel inferior, just as you can sort of wield your, greater amounts of wealth and your higher level of education, you can kind of wield your tastes and display them. And of course, the modern way people do that is through Instagram, right, and through social media, and saying, hey, look at me doing the right things. And often I think that takes, food is such a huge marker now, where people display their sort of, ostentatiously healthy eating practices. Look, and a lot of those practices are good in themselves, but it's the way that they're displayed and monopolized and used to shame families. Like in the book, I interview this Pacifica woman called Alexa Messina, and she talks about how there's just so many judgments made around the food choices of Pacifica families, even though in those families, like the parents often feel desperately guilty that they can't give their kids the things that, you know, they know that other kids are enjoying. What is the treat that might mean something to their kids that might make them feel good? It's going to McDonald's once a week, you know. And so these parents, they're not like feckless, they're not unaware of nutritional values. They're just doing something that anyone would do in their situation to try to give their kids, you know, a bit of a boost to make them feel good about themselves. But they get this massive cultural capital kind of judgment imposed on them because it's seen as an unhealthy, you know, eating practice. And if just one other example I could mention, you know, I've talked to a number of people who said, look, yeah, we see that cultural capital stuff playing out in the workforce. I've talked to lawyers who said, yeah, there are absolutely people in the legal profession who've got to a certain point, but have just not got that advancement because they don't know the codes for behaving. They don't have that cultural capital. They don't know how to behave politely. They don't know the right things to say at the right time. You know, they don't have the cultural references. They don't sort of scrub up, you know, in the boardroom. And that is a genuine limitation on people's ability to advance. And that's not education, and that's not wealth, that's cultural capital.
Yeah, that's very, very, very interesting, because that makes me think of the class system in the UK, where, you know, the country was founded by people trying to escape that. And now you're saying that we've very much recreated that. Intentionally, you know, if we think about the Milton Friedman-esque free market model that we seem to have adopted from the 1980s onwards, we have created this hierarchy. It's not just like what you've got, it's like, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, it's being of good breeding. I think you mentioned in the excerpt from your book that I'm familiar with. How does one overcome not knowing the right social graces? You know, like, what is the answer to that?
Well, that's a really tricky one, because, you know, in other, like, if you think about the sort of the other things that it matters to possess, what we sort of sometimes call capitals, you know, you've got financial capital and then human capital, which is another way to describe education. With those things, there's a really obvious way to try to equalize those things. I mean, easy to say and hard to do, but, you know, with wealth, well, it's obvious, you know, you need greater redistribution, right? You need greater tax contributions when people are doing really well. We need to do stuff to lift the incomes and wages of people at the bottom. You know, educational disparities. We need to make it easier for everyone to get a really good education. We need to remove the financial barriers, you know, the voluntary school fees, the tertiary fees, all the stuff that puts people off, you know, getting their full education. Cultural capital is a really hard one, though, because it's a bit of a zero-sum game. You know, the answer is not to send like every child in a low decile school to the opera, right? You know, because all you'd be doing is validating this idea that opera is superior to other kinds of cultural enjoyment. Now, I personally love opera, you know, I really, really do. But I don't think people should sort of be forced to consume it, and I don't think they should feel worse about themselves if they don't consume it. So, I mean, I actually think that's not one thing that you can actually maybe tackle directly. I think you have to tackle it through creating a world where most people have got a decent level of income and wealth, they can live well, they're really well educated, you know, they're doing professions that are respected and that are meaningful to them. And I think if you do all of that, the cultural capital stuff just becomes a bit less important. And also maybe at a more fundamental level, you know, again, easy to say, really hard to do. We just actually have to think differently about how we think about other people and just try to become less stigmatizing. And I know it's really hard to think about, well, how does that actually happen? How do you change a society like that? But ultimately, we have to see each other as equals and respect people in their different ways of life, with their different tastes and their different ways of speaking and their different accents and all the rest of it. Because I don't think there's any easy way for the state to level out those differences in cultural capital, if you know what I mean.
You know what you mean? You're a profoundly idealistic man, Max.
Well, yeah, but tempered with some realism. Like in the last chapter of my book, I do that classic thing that nonfiction authors always do: is like, here's 7 chapters about how terrible everything is. Here's the chapter about how things could be better. And again, it's a real cliche, but you can't get away from it when you're writing these books, because the alternative would be just to leave people with how depressing everything is. And I don't think that's responsible. So I do talk about some solutions, but in it, I also say, well, you have to think about where the New Zealand public is at. What is the polling? What does it tell us about how people feel about inequality and economic opportunity? And actually, so the solutions that I put forward, although there's an idealism in there, actually, I kind of tailor them a bit to what do I think you can do in this political moment in New Zealand.
And what do you think we can do at this particular political moment in New Zealand?
Well, there's a whole lot of things, right? And it's a classic problem when you're talking about inequality. There's no sort of silver bullet. And a lot of it comes down to politics. You know, it's kind of, inequality is even harder to solve than climate change in a way, I think, because climate change, at least you can go out and you can plant a tree, right? Or you can change your consumption habits. Inequality, you know, it's about a relationship, and it's really hard, and a lot of the answers are at the government level. So, you know, so I do think we need to put pressure on governments to do more to address these inequalities. I mean, I think in a lot of the answers are kind of straightforward. I mean, I support things like a kids KiwiSaver scheme. You know, enroll every child in KiwiSaver at birth, put a kickstart in, you know, say that you'll match whatever small contributions low-income families can make, you know, and so then you've got this asset base that's building up behind poorer children that will compensate them for the fact that, you know, other kids like me, you know, will get to 18, you know, like I was when I was 18, and will get help from their parents. You know, so that would kind of start to even out those unfairnesses, you know, in the way that my parents always brought us up to think that we should do. You know, things like Kids KiwiSaver, really investing in low decile schools, which are just struggling so hard, you know, with grappling with all the issues that their kids present with. I think we need to keep, you know, raising the minimum wage, doing more for people who are on benefits, you know, reducing the stigma and the sort of all the hoops that people have to jump through to get benefits. I think we need to keep amping up the state house building program, you know, really provide for people for whom the housing market is never going to work for. And to fund all of that, we have to do something about taxing wealth. You know, there's no other developed country in the world where we ask so little from wealthy people as we do in New Zealand. You know, there's no tax on wealth, there's no tax on capital gains, there's no tax on inheritances, no tax on gifts, no tax on land, no tax on property except for rates, there's no stamp duty, there's no tax on house sales. In any other developed country, you would have one or often more of those things. We have to have something like that if we're going to fund all those things that are actually going to increase opportunity for poorer kids, I think.
I vaguely remember Noam Chomsky at a lecture he gave at University of Auckland saying that we went through one of the most radical free market reforms without there being a military intervention somewhere along the way, right? Like if you think about like Chile or countries like that. And I was unaware that we are perhaps just that liberal. Are you saying that we have like a more economically liberal legislative system than the United States?
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing, right? Like people think about America as, you know, the home of free enterprise and small government and all the rest of it. And of course, up to a point, that's true. But, you know, there's this narrative, right, that you get in New Zealand. You say, well, we need to actually tax wealth, you know, in the same way like we tax income, make sure that people at the top are paying tax in the same way that I pay tax on every cent of my income. The narrative is, you know, your New Zealanders, rich New Zealanders will just leave. They'll go somewhere else. You'll frighten them off. And I always think, where would they go? If they go to Australia, where you have to pay a capital gains tax and you pay a top tax rate of 45 cents in the dollar, Would they go to England, where you have an inheritance tax? Or, would they go to America, where you have both a capital gains tax and an inheritance tax? Okay, it's quite a residual inheritance tax. It's been hacked back over the years, so only the tiny number of families at the top pay it. But yeah, we actually, in the 80s, we out Thatchered Thatcher, we out Reaganed Reagan. We went harder and faster on, privatizing stuff and selling state assets and cutting taxes and cutting benefits, probably than any other country in the world. Yeah, Chomsky's right, except for the ones that had military, interventions a la Chile. And the result is that we had the biggest increase in income inequality between the mid-80s and the mid-2000s of any developed country. We got this economic shock therapy that transformed our country like no other developed country was transformed, and substantially in a negative direction. And I don't think enough people realize that.
Yeah, enough people don't realize that. And again, when I look at like Twitter and stuff, we're talking often not about class and not about what comes with social class. How do you think we get a younger generation of the politically interested or activists or students like reinvigorated in the conversation around class and narrowing these gaps?
I think you can see elements of that starting to happen, actually. You're right, the energy, certainly in the last 10 or 20 years, well, certainly in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, had definitely swung around to, causes that were pushing back against racism, pushing back against sexism.
Which are great for anyone listening. Yeah. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm down with the cause, but...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And those movements were totally necessary. And I think they also gained a lot of their force precisely because the class-based movements had been so terrible in some senses and had explicitly tried to sideline those causes. If you look at the history of trade unions, and a woman called Sibel Locke at Vic wrote this great history called Workers from the Margins, I think. She really talked about, how poor a lot of the trade unions, for instance, were for a long time on gender issues. In some cases, almost actively hostile, to the entry of women into the workforce because it was seen as something that would suppress wages for men. So class-based analysis did itself absolutely no favors. And it's kind of no wonder it got superseded. Pardon me. So yeah, so it was off the radar for a long time. I think it's been actually coming back onto the radar slowly ever since probably the global financial crisis, I would say, and Occupy for all that Occupy didn't achieve anything like what it set out to achieve, that slogan, "We are the 99%." That's it's explicitly economic as a slogan. And I actually think it's also got really strong class overtones because it's saying, well, there is a very small elite here, the 1%, who exercise really disproportionate power and wealth. And I think, and that's been followed by, a lot of mobilization increasingly around economic issues. Like you see it in the States with the campaigns to raise the minimum wage there, which is actually sort of lower in purchasing terms probably than it was in the 1960s. I actually think there's been a big wave there. You look at the stuff that Bernie Sanders was channeling. Famously, Sanders was and probably still is a lot better on the economic stuff. He often looked awkward on race and gender issues, I think I would argue. And that was part of the stuff that limited his appeal. So I think that conversation is starting to happen. And I think also, one of the big things about class, right, is that it's intergenerational. It's explicitly intergenerational. If all these inequalities of wealth and education just reshuffled themselves and there was no link between parent and child, it'd be questionable if you really had a class system at all. It's the perpetuation through the generations that gives you a class system. And that's how it operates in the UK. And I've I've got a British passport. I lived there for a long time. I mean, I know how that works. And I think people are waking up to that as well. And of course, the big awakening is through the housing market, right? Everyone now knows that if you want to get a house, if your parents can't help you, it is close to impossible. It's not impossible, but it's getting close to impossible, especially in Auckland, right?
Bro, yes. I don't own a home. And I sometimes find myself on the verge of tears, like, I have a family and I'm self-employed, and I guess, I'm functionally middle class. Like, I don't want for anything week to week, but I find it really hard, like, to figure out how I can have the security of owning a home, right? And then also, obviously, setting up my stepson for his future. Do you know what I mean? And it's frustrating. I chucked just a thought up on Facebook, like, why don't we ban auctions, for example? That strikes me as something that spirals the price upwards and upwards and upwards. And I started reading an article yesterday. Apparently, only 4 or 5 years ago, like 10% of house sales were auctions, and now it's 60% in Auckland. And just makes it exponentially harder. You can't even figure out a budget for how much you can afford, because you turn up and then you get blown out of the water, like. And I think that's where I get frustrated with some of the right-wing takes that, I mean, if I'm putting it in a binary between left and right, it's like, well, if you just worked harder and you save better, you would probably have the deposit, and you wasted all on avocado on toast and it's your fault. And really it is quite structural, because a lot of people who are like middle class, it's not just like working class people, it's like a middle class that can't quite get there, because property goes up like $1 million over like a 10-year period, and nothing's been done to it. Like your wages are never gonna match that, like, growth and the acceleration in housing worth. Like, it's like, what do you do with that? It really stresses us all out. Like, it's boring how much we talk about it, but it's also like a real bummer, because we don't have rent controls, we don't have lifelong leases like other countries do. You really much are at the whim of whether you got a good landlord or not, like, because, if your kids go to school in the neighborhood and your landlord asks you to move out because they want to put their kids in the house that they own, you don't really fucking live with that much. I mean, I know it's shifted a little. Labor have put some better controls in place, but it's still not, it's not a particularly fair system, I'd argue, if you're trying to get into the housing market. Is that a fair emotional? That's my emotional. Obviously, I think about this a lot. I'm like gushing all over you, Max. Sorry, but
that's totally fair, and I really feel for you in that situation.
Oh, it's not poor me. Like, don't get me wrong. Like,
oh no, but it's emblematic of the situation that so many people are in. And I mean, since I've just been reading about the new German coalition government, right, which they've just sort of finally properly announced, and they're taking a whole ton of steps, like massively raising their minimum wage and things like that, and really going hard on climate change. One of the other things that they've said that is kind of in like their governing manifesto now is to go even harder on rent controls. I mean, not old-fashioned ones where you say, you can only charge this dollar amount, but I think what they're saying is they're going to limit increases in rents to 11% over 3 years, I think, and classically in Germany it's been more like 15% over 3 years. So just clamping down on that. And they've also promised to build something like 400,000 houses. I mean, of course, we've all heard that before, right? Promises about building houses, and look how that worked out. But the Germans have a much more functional system, and they do prefabrication really hard out. And they have incredible vocational education, so they probably won't be short of tradies in the way that we are. I can actually see them delivering on that promise. But what you're articulating is absolutely real, and it's one of the places where the class those class differences is biting hardest. I mean, we don't have really hardly any data on inheritances. I'm currently successfully pushing the New Zealand authorities to start collecting some proper data on it. But we know just anecdotally, like trustee firms like Perpetual Guardian have started coming out and saying, we're seeing this huge boom in bequests, and people passing wealth on to their children. And one of their chief executive was interviewed a while back saying, what we're starting to see now is people who have already helped, these are quite older people, who've helped their kids into property ownership. They're now putting money aside so they can help their grandchildren into property ownership. And look, I mean, that is a good thing for those grandchildren. I mean, that's not a negative thing in itself, but man, is that an unfairness to people.
Yeah, everyone else
Who don't have grandparents who can set money aside even after they've set money aside to help these people's parents. I mean, it's crazy, right?
It is. I was training a guy, so I'm a personal trainer as much as I'm a public speaker and all that sort of stuff. And I was training a guy in the park. Jim's a sharp. He is from a very working class background, ex-gang prospect, all this sort of stuff. And we're training in like a gentrified inner city suburb where I rent. And he said, I was like, yeah, man, it's crazy. It's like crazy rich around here. And he said, yeah, but you can't be mad at those people. Like he was quite matter of fact about, well, it's not their fault that their grandparents or their parents or both are wealthy. He's like, bro, if it was me, I'll be taking that money, And I'm curious to know, since you mentioned that it's political, and I find your personal journey very interesting in that you were deliberately developed in empathy, like your parents developed in empathy, and now you advocate politically so other people are as fortunate as you. How do we help people who have had an easier ride of it, who aren't bad people? I think that's where I get frustrated. Often we like other people who are more politically conservative or economically liberal, like they're bad people, they're selfish people, How do we help those people perhaps vote differently? Or how do we help, centre-right parties have a more compassionate economic policy? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit on one of the most difficult things, because I think there's a really horrible negative spiral, like a self-reinforcing dynamic around that stuff, where you get greater inequality. So you develop these neighborhoods where rich live with rich and poor live with poor. And so people see less of how the other half lives. And there's really good evidence on this. There's a study I quote in the book where people went and interviewed wealthy New Zealanders and about their attitudes, and they didn't support redistribution very much. And you're like, well, no surprises there, like that's blindingly obvious. But the reason they didn't support much redistribution is that they took their reading for how well the country was doing off the people they're surrounded by. And so they just massively underestimate how badly people are doing in New Zealand. And that all that stuff, so that's a negative spiral. You live more isolated, so you don't think there are problems, so you vote for policies that will make the problems even worse, and so people live more isolated from each other. How do you push back against that? Well, I mean, there's a bunch of methods. You can just appeal to people's empathy, and you don't actually need like the top 10% or whatever to come along for the ride. I mean, you can make significant change with 70 to 80% of the population on board. And then eventually the rest just come along for the ride because they're just like, oh, okay, actually assumptions have shifted, fine, we move on. Rich people behaved totally differently in 1950s and 60s New Zealand because the political climate was different to how they behave now. But more fundamentally, I do think, I mean, this is a bit sort of left field, and it's not something we really do, but I was interviewed in a big piece for the Sunday Star Times at the weekend about my book, and they had some quotes from Ronji Tanielu from the Salvation Army. And they said, people are living in their bubbles, and that's a really big problem, and we actually need programs that push back against that. And they were saying, look, I'd love to see like more marae open their doors so that, people can come in and see what it's like. I think we almost need like exchange programs. I mean, weird as that sounds, like kind of like school exchange programs, gap year exchange programs, where we fund people to go and live and work in communities that are different to theirs, so that they actually have a clue for what's going on, for how the other half lives. Because otherwise, I don't see how we're going to long-term build that empathy between rich and poor.
Yeah, I love that. I actually will, if you can like make that something we can vote on, Max, I will 100% be like, yo, that's a good idea. Let's get that happening. You know, I think I find myself in this interesting space where I used to have more of a, hang out with outsiders, right? And like economically marginalized people and yada, yada, yada. And over my life, now I have like people from all walks of life are in my day-to-day interactions. So it gives me an empathy for everyone. It's actually kind of like paralyzing almost if you, because you can kind of see it from lots of different perspectives. But it also makes you like more empathetic. Like when I was studying politics at university, I'd be like, fuck you if you voted for like, I don't know, ACT or whatever, you're a bad person. But having now known people who kind of have actually lived this, pulled themselves up by the bootstraps of life without the handouts and the hand-ups that we've been talking about today, I can actually understand why they think that way. And I'm curious to figure out how to reach those people and be like, yo, your story is anomalous to how most people live, right? Like not everyone who's, you know, I got a homie, he's a refugee and now he's like a multimillionaire with like a huge property portfolio. And I'm like, yo, that is impressive. But most people who have your background aren't gonna be able to get the same life outcomes that you have. And I think it's erroneous to believe that and vote accordingly. It's something I always think about, you know, like how do we help people understand that because it's true of you doesn't mean it's true of everyone? Do you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of people who, if you just worked harder or you just saved better or blah, 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 then things would get better. But I would argue, and you have the research to support that, structurally, that's just not true.
Yeah, and I don't think we've maybe done enough, you know, in this country in the last sort of few decades of articulating the extent just to which, you know, people's individual success relies on collective success. You know, and people like Elizabeth Warren have articulated this really well in the States. You know, if you've done well here, then, you know, that's fabulous. And often people will have worked hard. I mean, not always. Actually, my research on the rich list shows that, you know, at least a third of the fortunes there are actively dynastic. You know, they've been inherited from the previous generation, or they're being passed down to the next like the next generation are being brought in to run these, you know, multi-$100 million fortunes. So, you know, not everyone has worked super hard, but a lot of people have. I mean, you know, your example about this guy, you know, is absolutely apposite. Those people have worked hard, but they've also drawn really deeply from this collective pool of resources, almost like a physical pool, like a lake or something you would draw water from. You know, people have driven on roads that we all funded. You know, they've used the state education system almost certainly, you know, certainly at primary school level. They've used public healthcare system. They rely on the government courts system to enforce their contracts and punish offenders. They use, you know, state-funded ultra-fast broadband. They've really drawn deeply on that collective investment. And if that, just like a resource in nature, just like a lake or whatever that you take stuff out of, you have to put back into it. You have to replenish things, you know, otherwise they're not there for the next generation. And I think we have to talk to people like that and not, you know, have a go at them for their individual success, but just point out that they have to keep putting back into that pool if other people are going to succeed as well.
I love that. That's so poetic, Max. That's a very, very nice use of language to paint that picture.
Thank you. These are the benefits of having been an English literature graduate originally. You know, don't let anybody tell you that a BA is no use for anything. Totally has uses. And can I just say one other thing on this point? I do think that you know, history evolves kind of by point and counterpoint, like reaction and counter-reaction. And we have gone through a long period recently, and of course, social media has accelerated this, as everyone knows, of of very combative dialogue, right? People shouting at each other, that attitude you were talking about, that's everywhere. Everyone knows that it's kind of a banal point. But that's not guaranteed to continue forever and get worse, right? And I think a lot of people make a mistake. A lot of us, when we think about the future, we take a trend and we just think, well, the future is just going to be that trend continuing. So what's it going to look like if that trend continues in a linear fashion? But actually everything is point and counterpoint, right? Like you had the Reformation in Europe hundreds of years ago. And then you also had a counter-Reformation, which pushed back against a bunch of the stuff that the Reformation had done. And okay, the basic principles of the Reformation won out over time, but there's always these to and fro things. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the next 10 years, we actually slowly start to build spaces, online spaces, real spaces, structures, dialogues that actually do allow people to engage better across difference and push back against that really heated dialogue, which is like 99% of online debate at the moment.
Yeah, I really hope so, because I do see that happening. Like there's a whole range of like heterodox thinkers, which I've started following, people like Jonathan Haidt, social commenters like Aisha Aikambi. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. New Discourses is a space by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, who wrote a book called Cynical Theories. Anyway, I have started seeing that, and I'm kind of hopeful for it, because I do worry in a very real sense that we'll see more like tangible physical violence and our social institutions start crumbling, which you're seeing in America. Obviously Capitol riots is a great example of that, because we have such disparate realities and we live in the bubbles that you've been talking about. And then social media amplifies all of this. And we can't recognize our shared humanity in one another anymore across class and identity lines. I really hope that what you're saying does come to pass, because we have this polarization, and the extremes on either end of that dominate the discourse, and the algorithm encourages that, and multi-billion-dollar corporations love it. Everyone's hooked at like calling people names on the internet, but it's very, it's detrimental to social cohesion. And it does make me a bit scared. I know I can be a bit of an anxious, pessimistic thinker at times, but I do worry about it. So I hope that what you say, I hope it bears fruit, man.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, look, and it's really complex, right? Because, there's also that sort of debate about cancel culture. But one of the great ironies is that the people who critique cancel culture, the way they talk about things is as bad as the way that people who are into cancelling talk about things. So like people who critique cancel culture don't understand that there is actually sometimes something to it. There are people who should be deplatformed. There are Nazis out there who we don't have to listen to, and things like that. And all like the anger that you get sometimes on social media. I mean, some anger is really important, right? I mean, as someone who's had a very easy life, I need to hear the anger, certainly that is being expressed by people who are being genuinely oppressed themselves, because I remember something I found really profound is someone said, a philosopher said, anger has real informational value. It tells you where people are at. It tells you how bad things are. If people weren't really angry about like the poverty and the racism they experience, I probably would not realize how bad things are. If they just talked about it in a nice rational tone of voice, I would probably think, actually, do you know what? It's not that bad. So, some of that anger is really important, and we have to be open to hearing it. And, some people like Jonathan Haidt, who you mentioned, I've got his book, The Righteous Mind. And I think some of the stuff is great. But then when he talks about like the coddling of the American mind, and sort of has a go at young Americans for being snowflakes, I sort of think, I think you're kind of missing the point that a lot of what these people are pushing back against is really dangerous stuff. And there are reasons sometimes for deplatforming people, and certainly we don't all have to go out and have dialogue with Nazis. There's got to be a balance of those things.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of coupling up the American mind, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Because yes, you're right. Like, we don't want David Duke spreading his ideas, right? Like,
yeah.
But not everyone's David Duke. I feel like there's been a bit of a mission creep in there. People who've got ideas that might make you feel uncomfortable, but they're not hateful. You just don't agree with them. And you see this a lot in the gender identity debate, right? Like, who just lost their job over in the UK, Kathleen Stock, and others who aren't by any stretch of the imagination hate mongers and bigots. They're just quote unquote gender critical feminists who advocate for, I don't know, biological differences between males and females. They are starting to like lose their jobs. And I would argue that that's not okay, because you should be able to have a rational debate that's respectful and find like that tension and rights between people whose gender identities don't match their biological realities. And that, how do we help them? Like, how do we help create a society where everyone is valued and seen and has equal opportunities? But at the same time, yeah, I don't fucking know where I'm going with this. How do we help everyone? How do we help everyone have a fair go? That's what I want to know. You know what I mean? And I feel like shouting down people, you can't find answers if you can't ask questions. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think universities are the space where that should happen, and maybe that's robust, but you should never be able to like bring flares to a university and encourage people to like get killed, which kind of happens in some of the more radical campuses in the UK and in England, the UK and the United States. And I worry, how everything filters down culturally may happen here at one stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Look, and some of those debates that you're talking about, around that British academic Kathleen, I mean, I haven't followed closely, and I'm not 100% sure what's going on there. I do think, I haven't seen or heard a lot of stuff on New Zealand university campuses that bothers me. Just like so far, we mostly haven't imported kind of the culture war stuff that, American Republicans in particular, and actually, the British Conservatives, unfortunately now seem really keen on pushing, because I think that whole dialogue is pretty toxic. I just think I don't sort of have a lot of sort of really concrete answers. I do, and I think it is tricky because, in a funny way, I think we need to be better at having both tougher and gentler conversations in New Zealand.
Perfect. Yes.
Because because we, what you and I are talking about is that, we need to be better at sort of speaking to each other across difference. And we're not very good at that, I think, as New Zealanders. But as New Zealanders, we also shy away from tough conversations a lot of the time. And like too often we won't speak up when we think things are difficult. I mean, online and Twitter is the great counterexample, but I think in person, which is what matters most of the time, too many New Zealanders are too afraid of having a robust conversation about things. So we kind of look in doing either of those things, being better at the robust conversations or being better at the gentler ones is difficult enough in itself. How we as a country are going to get to a point where we're better at doing both of those things, that's quite tough, and I don't really have the answers, but I think that is the challenge that we face right now.
I agree. Hey, Max, this has been a real pleasure. I've taken a lot of your time out of your busy schedule, so I won't keep you any longer. Just to finish, if anyone wants to find you, follow your work, where can they check you out, man?
So I'm reasonably active on Twitter, Mx Rashbrooke. I have a TED.com talk called 3 Ways to Upgrade Democracy.
Over 1 million views. Well done.
Thank you. That's the amazing power of that platform. And that's a really succinct introduction to my feelings about how we need to renew democracy and do it quite differently in the 21st century. And if anyone wants to check out my new book, which handily enough, I have a copy of here. How about that? That is it. Too Much Money, Wealth Disparities or Unbalancing Aotearoa New Zealand. That's available in bookstores or from my publisher's website.
Amazing. You're a great man. Thank you very much for your work and your research and taking the time to talk with us. I look forward to following you in the future, man.
Thank you very much.